Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 2 of our study on Paul's letter to the Philippians. As a way of a reminder, this class is a verse-by-verse study, so I highly encourage you to grab a Bible and go through God's Word with us together. Also, as a way of a reminder, there are study guides available for this class. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a link or a web address to where you can go and download the study guides for this class. Today we are going to be looking at study guide number 2 that will go along with lesson number 2. So I hope you will take some time and download those. It will greatly enhance your study. The study guides contain a copy of the text that we're going to cover along with a number of notes and cross-references, other verses in the Bible. So I hope that they will be beneficial. Now, as a reminder, another reminder, in lesson number 1, we began looking at Acts chapter 16 and the founding or the establishment of the church at Philippi. As we talk about that, working our way up to looking at the letter itself. Now, we finished off last week in verse 15, and so we're going to begin today in verse 16. Now, just briefly, what we saw last time was we saw as Paul and Silas began their journey, they encountered Timothy, they circumcised Timothy. They had the call to Macedonia that they received in Troas, and then they ultimately ended up in Philippi, and we began to see the first of the conversions in Philippi as Lydia and her household were converted, and Paul and his group, which now includes Luke and Timothy, they are making their base of operations for Philippi out of Lydia's home. And we'll pick up today in verse 16, and it says, as we were going to the place of prayer. Now I'm going to stop there for just a second because we were introduced to the place of prayer last week. When Paul first arrived in Philippi, he went to this place of prayer, which was simply a place near the river where the Jewish women would gather to pray. And Paul arrived there, went there on the Sabbath when he arrived. And you can read about that in verse 13 of Acts 16. It says, we were met by a slave girl. And as a reminder, Luke is the author of Acts, and Luke presumably joined this group in Troas. If you look back at verse 10, you'll see that Luke began using the pronoun we once they arrived in Troas, which leads most, including myself, to believe that Luke joined the group in Troas. And he will be with the group until they leave Philippi, when Luke will stay in Philippi. It says, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that phrase, spirit of divination. Literally what that phrase says is that she had a Pythian spirit. Now, you may have never heard that phrase before. It's a pretty unique phrase. But Pythian, spelled Pythian, is literally what that phrase says, that she was filled with a Pythian spirit. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what that means. This goes all the way back to 1400 BC and the beginning of the oracle at Delphi, being one of the most significant sites in ancient Greece. And legend or ancient mythology says that the oracle at Delphi was protected by a great python, and that the god Apollos struck down the python at oracle. Now, over time, that python, or Pythia, if you will, also became the name of the oracle, and then ultimately the priestess that served at Delphi that would propose to tell people's fate. And so the snake, the name of the snake, the Pythia, the python, becomes the name of the oracle, becomes the name of the priestess, and eventually anyone who was thought to be filled with a spirit or to be able to tell the future was said to have been filled with the spirit of the Pythia, or a Pythian spirit. And that is why it says that this slave girl was filled with the Pythian spirit, the spirit of divination. And it says, and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. And so it says in verse 17 that she followed Paul and us, keeping in mind that Luke is writing this. He's with them. And so you've got Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke. It says she followed Paul and us, crying out. Now listen to these words. These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation. Now, Luke tells us in verse 16 that this girl is filled with the Spirit. And then he says that this girl filled with this Spirit recognizes them as servants of God, and not just saying God, but the Most High God. Now, the phrase the Most High God was used of Hebrews to describe Yahweh. So this spirit inside this girl is calling Yahweh by the name that the Hebrews call him, the Most High God. And we can, if those of you that have the study guide, if you look in the text, you'll see I have a note out to the right of that verse that has examples of where Yahweh is referred to throughout the Old Testament as the Most High God. But this spirit within this girl recognizes Paul and his group as servants of Yahweh, and that they're proclaiming the way of salvation. Now, the Gospels are filled with examples of demons, those who were demon-possessed, that those demons recognized Jesus and who he was, that he was the Christ. And so that it's not unusual that this spirit or this demon inside this girl recognizes them as being servants of God. But let's keep going, and we'll come back and talk about this a little more in just a minute. It says, and this she kept doing for many days. What was she doing? Well, she was following them around, proclaiming that they were servants of God, that they were proclaiming the way of salvation. It says she did this for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out that very hour. And incidentally, in Mark chapter 16, Jesus had told his apostles that they would have power over spirits, power over demons. And Paul, being an apostle of Jesus Christ, clearly had power over spirits or over this demon. But a couple of questions here as it relates to this event. So let's just think about the facts. So this girl is following Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy around. She's, through this spirit, is proclaiming that they're servants of the Most High God, that she's proclaiming that they are proclaiming the way of salvation. We read that Paul was annoyed. Well, one, why did Paul wait so long? If he was annoyed by her, if this irritated him, why did he wait so long to cast out this spirit? Why did he wait so long to react? Well, we don't know for certain, but my belief is that Paul waited because he knew that at whatever point that he interceded and cast out this spirit or cast out this demon, that was likely going to be the end of his ministry in Philippi. Why is that? Well, because these were individuals, there were individuals that owned this girl that were benefiting greatly by the fact that she was filled with this spirit and she could, presumably tell the future, though I don't know that we can know whether she could or could not. But they were benefiting. They were gaining fame. They were gaining wealth from her abilities. And so Paul had to know, if I intercede here, this is going to cause some chaos. And we can see that at the point in which he did intercede, for the rest of this time that he was in Philippi, it was chaos. His ministry was effectively ended, and to where, very soon after, not only were he and Silas put in prison, but he was asked to leave. And so I think the reason why Paul delayed was because he didn't want the ministry in Philippi to end that quickly. The next question I want us to think about is, well, why did Paul stop her at all? I mean, we read that he was annoyed, but can't we argue that she was speaking the truth? That she was saying that they were servants of the Most High God, that she was saying that they were proclaiming the way of salvation. So why would Paul stop her if she were telling the truth? Well, again, this is just, my opinion, but I believe there's, again, another a couple of possible reasons here why he might have done that. One is, we can say that, this is a spirit, perhaps a demon, and maybe it was that Paul did not want to give the appearance that Jesus, that he was the apostle for, the Christ, was somehow united with this spirit, this demon, that he did not want them to seem as though they had a connection. And so he did not want this to continue because he didn't want them to be seen as being connected. And in a similar way, I think that, perhaps this was, Satan's attempt to gain favor for his spirit, for his demon, by connecting himself with one who was a servant of Jesus. Well, so how does that work? Well, if you think about it this way, if people thought that they were connected, then the good things that were done by Jesus' followers might be attributed to Satan, but at the same time, the evil things that were done by the followers of Satan, his demons, might be attributed to Jesus. And so I think Paul knew that we can't let this go on. We can't let this connection continue to exist, or this perception of a connection. And so he commands this spirit to come out. It says it came out that very hour. Now, I just asked the question, well, why did he delay? And my belief is that because he knew this was going to be the beginning of the end of his ministry, at the point in which he cast out this spirit, or cast out this demon. And we see that that's exactly the case. If you look in verse 19, it says that when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. So why did this happen? Why did they drag them in front of the marketplace? Well, they knew that if they dragged them in front of the marketplace, they could raise a crowd. They knew that if they did this in a public place, they could raise a commotion. They could raise a crowd. They could create a public uproar. And again, that's exactly what happened. It says they brought them before the rulers, and then the rulers are described in verse 20 as, it says, when they had brought them to the magistrates. Now, a magistrate could have been either a military or a civil ruler, so we don't know exactly, but who they were. But these were individuals of leadership in government. They were of Roman leadership that were a part of the city of Philippi. And so they got them in this public place. They've drugged them out to create an uproar, and they bring them in front of the magistrates. Now, before we look at what they said, let's think about what their motivation is. It tells us back in verse 19 that they had lost their hope of gain. So they had lost their source of income. They had lost their source of wealth, their source of power, their source of fame. So that's their real motivation. But let's look at what they said. If you look in verse 20, so when they brought them in front of the magistrates, it says they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." Look at verse 21. "They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice." Now, this was a very clever accusation, but it wasn't the reason why they were upset. They were upset because they had lost their source of gain. They were upset because they had lost their source of income, but they instead concocted a very clever accusation. Well, why is this clever? Well, a couple of things. One, they're bringing something up that's going to get the attention of the Roman leadership, because the Roman leadership, the last thing in the world they want is an uproar. The last thing they want is an uprising, or for people to riot. And that's what these owners are trying to cause to happen, is they're trying to create this uproar. They're trying to create a riot. If you look in verse 20, where it says that they were disturbing our city, this brings to mind, I've got a reference in the study guide to Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. This brings to mind very much the accusations that the Jews brought against Jesus when they brought him before Pilate. Because, the Jews were concerned about Jesus teaching things that were contrary to their customs, their traditions, that he was going to take away their religious power. But instead, when they brought him in front of Pilate, they brought up the accusation that he's disrupting, he's causing disruption. And Pilate would have been very sensitive to that, because his instructions from Rome would have been to keep the peace. And so they knew that was something that would elicit Pilate's attention. And these owners are doing the exact same thing in bringing Paul and Silas in front of the people and in front of the leaders, as they're saying, they're disturbing our city. Now, they weren't concerned about the disturbance. They were concerned about their loss of gain. And by the way, they also say these men are Jews. One convenient thing that's left out that they may not have known, but we're going to read about later, is that Paul was a Roman citizen. And if you remember back to last week when we talked a little bit about Philippi, that Philippi was a Roman colony because of the soldiers that settled there after the Civil War in 42 BC. And so Philippi was a Roman colony and Paul was a Roman citizen. But to this point, the rulers only know that they're Jews. And so the other part of the accusation comes in verse 21. It says, they advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. And this is maybe one step beyond that they're causing an uproar, because the introduction of a new mode of worship or a new religion was forbidden by Roman laws. It was not allowed under Roman law. So they're bringing up kind of two things that are going to bring the attention of these Roman leaders, the magistrates, again, that have nothing to do with their true motivation for why they're upset. And they achieved their goal. If you look in verse 22, it says that the crowd joined in attacking them. And so they brought them into a public place. They brought them in front of the public place, in front of the rulers. And what happens? The crowd joined in attacking them. And the magistrates tore their garments off of them, which is a sign of just anguish, and gave orders to beat them with rods. Now, let's keep going. So in verse 23, it says, when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison. Now, I'm going to stop there in the middle of verse 23. I want to talk about them being beaten with rods. Maybe in your study of Scripture, you've encountered the rule or the provision that someone could not receive more than 40 lashes. Well, that was a Jewish rule. That was a Jewish provision that was not applicable to the Romans. And so we don't know how many blows they would have received from the Romans, because they were not limited by the number of lashes or the number of strikes that they could receive. And it brings to mind in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul, the letter that Paul wrote later to the church in Corinth, the second letter he wrote to the church in Corinth, that in chapter 11, he is defending his credibility. He's defending his right to be an apostle. He's defending his position as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. And in that, he talks about all the struggles that he has endured. And he talks about the number of times that he has endured receiving 40 lashes minus one. They took one away to make sure they didn't go over. But then also he says that 3 times I was beaten with rods. And clearly this was one of the times that he was beaten with rods, from a Roman punishment. So they had inflicted many blows. We don't know how many, but we have to believe that this was a severe beating. When they had inflicted many blows upon them, and threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. That's verse 23. And then verse 24 says, having received this order, he put them into the inner prison. Now I want you to hang on to that phrase, inner prison, and fasten their feet in the stocks. So Paul and Silas are beaten with rods with many blows, and they're thrown into prison. Now, what's the significance of it saying that they were put into the inner prison? Well, a Roman prison was typically contained kind of 3 areas, if you will, or three areas where prisoners were placed depending on the severity of their crime. The outermost area, and if you look in the study guide, I've got these listed out in the lower left-hand corner of the front page where the text is listed. And you'll see they've got the 3 different levels. So the first level is kind of the low security prison, minimum security prison, where they're allowed to receive light, they're allowed to receive fresh air. Then the second level of the prison is they're shut off with strong iron gates. They're with strong locks. And then you've got the inner part of the prison, which is where Paul and Silas were placed. And the inner part of the prison allowed no natural light. The prisoners were placed in stocks, as Paul and Silas were. And again, there's no natural light. And this is the place where prisoners were waiting to be executed. This was death row. And so Paul and Silas go from, teaching the gospel to Paul casting out this spirit from this girl, to very quickly being dragged into the marketplace, being falsely accused in front of the magistrates, being beaten with rods and thrown into prison and placed on death row. And the jailer is given instructions to keep them, because these are kind of prized prisoners, if you will, but they are placed on death row. This is significant. Now, I'm going to stop our study, right there in verse 24 for lesson 2. But I want you to go ahead, if you've got time before our next lesson, which comes next week, lesson 3. We're going to finish out next time this study of the planting of the church at Philippi. And I want you to go ahead and read ahead and look at how Paul and Silas react to these events. And I want you to think about, how would you react if you had been falsely accused, if you had been beaten with rods, if you had been unjustly placed in prison and put on death row? How would you react? And then how does that compare to how Paul and Silas react? And then what happens because of their reaction, the way that they react? And we see the continuation of the conversions in Philippi before Paul and Silas are asked to leave the city. I hope that you're benefiting from these studies. I hope that you're benefiting from going through this establishment of the church at Philippi as we work our way towards the letter that Paul writes to this church. I want to make sure that we understand the situation, the context of why, how this church was established, what the situation was, so that we have more insight into the letter itself and the reason why Paul had such a close and unique relationship with these Christians. So I hope you're benefiting from this study. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you all.